This all went down a few years back. My folks had taken off to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for a 3-day work conference, leaving me in charge of the house, and more importantly, in charge of my 15-year-old sister, Brooke. I was 17 at the time, wrapping up my senior year of high school, already eyeballing the class schedule at the local community college. My parents trusted me enough to keep things under control while they were gone, and we figured Brooke and I could handle a couple days on our own without a problem. That first night started out pretty chill. We grabbed some takeout, crashed on the couch, and zoned out in front of the TV until it got late. Sometime around 11 p.m., Brooke started getting a little antsy. The wind outside made the house groan, and every creak or thump sounded way louder than usual with just the two of us there. I tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about our ancient plumbing and how the windows always liked to sing when the wind picked up. Eventually, we both got sleepy and headed to our rooms. I was a little on edge myself, but I managed to knock out pretty quickly. Nothing weird happened that night. The next day rolled by like any regular day. Brooke spent most of the afternoon on the phone, gossiping with her friend about some biology project, while I messed around on my computer with this new design software I was using for a final project. Honestly, we'd already shrugged off the weird vibes from the night before. Later that evening, I had some homework to wrap up, so I set up shop in the living room with my laptop. I had the local news running in the background, half watching while I worked. Around 10 p.m., Brooke decided to whip up a quick dinner, just some pasta with tomato sauce. I could hear her banging around in the kitchen, the faucet running as she filled a pot to boil water. Then, out of nowhere, she let out this blood-curdling scream. I bolted into the kitchen, heart pounding, and found her backed up against the counter, shaking. Her eyes were huge, and she was pointing toward the kitchen window above the sink. She barely managed to whisper that there'd been a man standing out there, staring straight at her. She said he was covered in blood, dark, wet smears all over his chest and arms. Trying not to freak out, I ran to the window to check. The porch light was on, but no one was there. The backyard looked completely still, aside from the tall, untrimmed bushes swaying a little in the wind. I told Brooke maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, trying to keep her calm, but she was seriously shaken up. We decided to shut the blinds and just get dinner over with, even though neither of us really felt like eating at that point. Before heading upstairs, we double-checked every door and window in the house, making sure everything was locked up tight. Brooke was still uneasy, so I offered to hang out in her room until she fell asleep. Once she was out, I went back to my own room, thinking the worst was probably behind us. Then, around 3 a.m., I shot awake to this loud, frantic pounding on the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was more like someone was trying to break it down. My heart was racing, and I just froze in place. The banging kept going for what felt like forever, even though it was probably only a few minutes. And then, just like that, it stopped. Silence. I didn't even dare move a muscle. I stayed completely still, straining my ears. The only thing I could hear was the low hum of the fridge downstairs. The rest of the night stayed dead quiet. Brooke and I barely slept a wink. When the sun finally came up, I couldn't take the suspense anymore. I grabbed the kitchen trash bag and headed outside to dump it in the bins by the side of the house. That's when I saw him, someone lying face down on the grass, right next to our little vegetable garden. At first I thought he might be hurt, so I crept over slowly, calling out to see if he'd respond. But as I got closer and stood over him, it hit me, he wasn't breathing. His shirt was soaked in blood, and his face was turned away from me. My stomach knotted up the second I saw him. I had no idea who the guy was. My hands were trembling as I fished around for my phone to call the cops. Not long after, Officer Delgado showed up with 2 other officers in tow. They got to work right away, inspecting the body and taking notes. Then came the questions, tons of them. Did we hear any gunshots? Had we seen anyone wandering around outside? Did we recognize the man? Brooke and I told them everything we knew. We talked about what she saw at the window, the banging on the door, all of it. The cops looked just as thrown off as we were. They didn't say much, just that they'd let us know if they figured anything out. They took the body with them, and that was that. We never even found out the guy's name. Nobody in the neighborhood reported seeing anything weird. And when the cops checked for missing persons, nothing matched. Later that day, Mom and Dad got home, completely freaked out once they heard what had happened. They grilled us with questions, hoping maybe we left something out, but there wasn't anything else to say. Brooke was still jumpy, and I couldn't shake this eerie feeling, like something had settled over the house and just wouldn't lift. And honestly, that feeling never really went away. To this day, no one's ever figured out who that man was or how he ended up dead in our yard. The police didn't uncover any clear signs of foul play, other than the injuries, of course, but they never offered any real answers either. No backstory, no motive, just silence. That night, we were just two teenagers trying to handle things on our own. We didn't ask for any of it, but somehow, we ended up tangled in a mystery that still haunts me. Even now, every time I walk past that kitchen window, I can't help but picture it, the bloodied man standing there in the dark, staring inside. And I keep wondering, why our house? Why us? We never got a reason. Fast forward to just last month. My husband, Harper, and I had planned a quiet weekend at the old family farmhouse in rural Missouri. Harper's in the Army, stationed over at Fort Leonard Wood. But right before the trip, his leave request got denied. He told me to go anyway, said it'd be good for the kids and me to get some downtime. So, I packed up our two kids, Emily's 8 now, and little Mason just turned 5, and got ready for a low-key getaway from the noise of city life. I've been driving trucks for years, learned it from my dad who used to run long hauls all over the country. So hopping into our old Dodge Ram for a 3-hour drive felt like second nature. The route from Springfield to the farmhouse, near this tiny town called Willow Falls, is usually a smooth one. Just open 2-lane roads, gentle hills, and farmland stretching out in every direction. It's the kind of drive where you can breathe easy. We hit the road around noon on June 15th. The kids were buzzing with excitement, digging into their snack bags and flipping through coloring books in the back seat while I kept my eyes on the road. The weather couldn't have been better, mid-80s with a light breeze, and traffic was almost non-existent. Honestly, I was enjoying the ride. When you're used to the noise and rush of city life, an empty road and familiar scenery can feel like therapy. About an hour in, I noticed a rusty old maroon sedan in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another car on the road. But after a good 10 minutes, it hadn't passed me, even though we were on a stretch with clear passing lines and no oncoming traffic. It was odd. The car just hovered a few lengths behind me, going the exact same speed, like it was purposely sticking to me. I told myself not to overthink it. People get distracted, or maybe the driver was just being extra careful. Still, something about it didn't sit right. Something just didn't sit right with me. Every time I nudged the speed up a bit, that sedan behind me did the same. And when I eased off the gas, it slowed down too, matching me like a shadow. The kids were in their own world, talking nonstop about the games they were planning to play once we got to the farmhouse. Meanwhile, my instincts were starting to whisper louder. So, to put my gut to the test, I veered off the main road and took a smaller route, one I normally wouldn't bother with. Sure enough, the sedan made the same turn. That tight, anxious feeling started to build in my stomach. Still, I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe it was just someone local who happened to be heading the same direction. About 10 or 15 minutes passed, and then the sedan crept closer, close enough that I could catch a glimpse of the driver's face in my side mirror. He looked like he was somewhere in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. I couldn't make out his hair color or get a clear look at his eyes. For a second, it looked like he might try to pass me. But instead, he dropped back again, like he just wanted me to know he was there. That's when Emily noticed how often I was checking my mirrors and asked if something was wrong. I gave her a small nod and said I was just being extra careful with my driving. No way I was gonna spook them, especially Mason. He was already the jumpy type, scared of everything from bugs to thunder. When we spotted a little convenience store just off the highway, I figured it was a good chance to test if we were really being followed. I signaled and pulled into the gravel parking lot, watching closely to see what the sedan would do. It kept driving. Didn't even slow down. Just cruised past like nothing had happened. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that maybe it really was just coincidence. Inside, we made a quick stop for the restroom and grabbed a couple drinks for the road. Everything seemed back to normal after that. I even made some small talk with the clerk, mostly about the weather and how the local farmland was holding up. No mention of the weird car or any suspicious drivers. We climbed back into the truck and hit the road again. About 20 minutes later, something caught my eye in the rearview. A car, way back, too far to see clearly, but something about it made my stomach twist again. Could have been that same maroon sedan, or maybe not. I kept sneaking glances, trying to get a clearer view, but the sunlight hitting my mirror made it tough. The outline of the headlights looked familiar though, too familiar. My heart started beating faster, even though I tried to stay calm and keep driving like normal. Then we came to a curve in the road that went uphill slightly. I lost sight of the car behind us. When we came out the other side, it was gone. Just vanished. Part of me was relieved, but another part felt uneasy. How did it disappear so fast? Maybe it turned off down a side road, or maybe it pulled over and waited. A few more miles down the highway, the kids started getting cranky about being hungry. I was feeling it too. I remembered there was a rest area coming up in about 5 minutes, one I'd stopped at before. I put on my signal and took the exit, half expecting to see that sedan pop up in my mirror again. But it never showed. The rest stop was mostly deserted, just one semi parked off to the side. I pulled up close to the building, making sure we were parked under good lighting. We got out, stretched our legs, and looked around a bit. No sign of that car. Not even one that looked like it. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling, like eyes were on me. My head kept swiveling around, scanning the area. We hit the restrooms, grabbed a few snacks from the vending machines, and sat down at one of those weathered picnic tables for a little break. At one point, an older lady strolled past us, walking her dog. She gave a small nod and kept going, didn't say a word. After a few quiet minutes, I started feeling kind of foolish, like maybe I'd let my imagination run wild. I mean, nothing had actually happened, right? So we packed up and climbed back into the truck, ready to finish the last leg of the drive to the farmhouse. I stayed alert, glancing at my mirrors as we merged back onto the highway. But everything looked totally normal, just your usual cars and a few big rigs here and there. The rest of the drive went off without a hitch. And when we finally turned onto that familiar dirt road that led to our old farmhouse, the kids burst into cheers. The sun was dipping low, casting that golden, peaceful glow across the fields, and the tension that had been gnawing at me finally started to ease up. I lost my little girl back in 2012. Saying that out loud still stings, even after all these years. We were living in Brooklyn at the time, and her passing came so suddenly, I didn't have a moment to brace myself. Since then, whenever the memories started weighing too heavy, I'd make my way to Greenwood Cemetery to visit her grave. It became this quiet little ritual for me, a place where I could reflect, talk to her in my mind, and feel close, even though she was gone. If you've ever lost someone who meant the world to you, you probably understand that pull. There's something about a cemetery at night, it's oddly calming, but it can be unsettling, too. There's a strange peace in the silence. But at the same time, yeah, it's eerie. All those headstones in the dark, it messes with your senses. For me though, it felt like I was having a moment with my daughter, hoping somehow she could hear me. One night, I just couldn't sleep. It was around 10 p.m. when this heavy wave of grief hit me out of nowhere. I had this overwhelming urge to visit her. A friend of mine once warned me not to wander around cemeteries after dark, and I get why, but that night, I didn't care. I told myself it was her anniversary, even though it had technically passed a few days earlier. I needed to go. It felt like the only thing that would bring me any peace. The air that night was weirdly still, and even though it was early fall, the temperature had dropped more than usual. By the time I pulled up near Greenwood Cemetery, it was close to 10:30. The street was completely deserted, lit only by a lonely street lamp way off in the distance. Not a single car drove by, no one on foot, just me, standing there, heart racing. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I noticed one of the side gates was cracked open. Technically, the place closes at dusk, but sometimes they forget to lock every entrance. Maybe they just assumed everyone had left. I gave the gate a gentle push, and it creaked open. I slipped inside. Greenwood is huge, beautiful during the day, with statues, trees, winding paths. But at night, it's a whole different place. The shadows swallow everything. What feels peaceful in the daylight becomes something heavier. Every step I took crunched loud against the gravel. Louder than it should have been. Like the quiet was so deep, even my footsteps were intruding on it. I tried to step as quietly as I could, like I didn't want to stir a soul. As I moved closer to where my daughter rested, I caught myself looking around, like my instincts were on edge. It almost felt like I wasn't alone out there, like eyes were on me. Sounds ridiculous, I know. I've been to that place more times than I can count, and the worst I've ever run into was the occasional wandering cat. Still, something about that night felt off. The air had this heavy stillness to it, like the whole cemetery was waiting, holding its breath. When I finally got to her headstone, I dropped to my knees, and the wet grass immediately soaked through my jeans. I leaned in and whispered a few things, words I wish I'd had the chance to say before she was gone. My throat tightened up, and my eyes started to sting. Maybe it was the silence pressing in or just the weight of my own grief, but I started picking up on little sounds I'd never noticed before. A faint rustle behind me, something that almost sounded like footsteps. Or maybe it was just the wind messing with me. Then I saw them, figures, way off in the distance. At first, it was just one. Then another. Then a third. They were standing under the weak glow of the moon, and from where I stood, it looked like they were wearing long, white gowns. My first thought was maybe they were caretakers or some kind of volunteers doing a nighttime ceremony. But caretakers dressed in white robes. That didn't sit right. The way they moved was slow and deliberate, and they didn't say a word to one another. All three of them turned their heads at the same time, like they were scanning the rows of graves together. I didn't hear a single voice, but the tightness in my chest told me enough. Something about them just didn't feel normal. I tried to tell myself it might be a family holding a late-night vigil, or maybe some paranormal group chasing ghosts for kicks. But the longer I watched, the more uneasy I felt. I thought for a second about calling out to them, but something in me said no. The idea of getting their attention scared me more than whatever curiosity I had. So, I started to stand up real slow, thinking it was time to head back. But the second my shoes scraped against the gravel, the sound echoed louder than I expected. One of the figures jerked its head in my direction, like it heard me crystal clear. My heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. In that moment, it hit me, they might actually come this way. I didn't know what I'd get if they did. Were they friendly? Or something else entirely? I eased backward, staying close to the curved line of headstones, trying to keep my steps light and quiet. Then I chanced a quick glance over my shoulder. All three of them started moving toward me, still keeping that same slow, soundless pace. The moonlight hit their faces in such a way that I couldn't make out any real features, just these pale, empty expressions that sent a chill down my spine. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach twist. They weren't carrying flashlights. No lanterns, no glow of a phone screen. Nothing. They just kept gliding forward, the hems of their white gowns brushing softly against the ground. I picked up my pace, weaving through a narrow trail lined with tall, decorative tombs that felt like they were closing in on me. My thoughts started racing. Who the hell were these people? What were they doing out here in the middle of the night dressed like that? I turned corner after corner, my memory getting foggy, trying to remember how to get back to the main path, the one that led out. Somewhere behind me, I caught the sound of whispering. It was low and quick, like someone urgently muttering secrets. Maybe it was just the wind slipping through the gravestones. Or maybe it was them. That creeping panic was now full-blown. My sense of direction started slipping. Normally, I knew my way around the place like the back of my hand, but fear can mess with you. Every path looked the same. I felt lost. Then, like a light at the end of a tunnel, I spotted the soft, orange glow of the street lamp near the entrance, peeking through the silhouettes of the mausoleums. Relief hit me like a wave, and I took off toward it, practically sprinting. The gate was still cracked open. I pushed through it fast, stumbling a little as I landed on the sidewalk outside. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to slow my breathing. For a second, I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? Hey, there were 3 people in gowns chasing me through a cemetery. It sounded like something straight out of a bad horror movie. And they hadn't technically done anything illegal, as far as I could prove. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop all over again. Parked just across the street, half hidden in the shadows, was this old, beat-up van. Its headlights were off, but someone was definitely sitting in the driver's seat, watching me. I could see the shape shift slightly, like they leaned forward right as I stepped out from the gate. My heart started pounding all over again. I couldn't make out any clear details, just a dark silhouette. Before I could move or even think, the engine kicked on. The headlights stayed off, and the van rolled quietly down the street, humming low like it didn't want to be noticed. I stood there, frozen, until it finally disappeared around the corner. Then I booked it home, constantly looking over my shoulder the whole way. That night I barely slept. My brain just wouldn't shut off. Were those 3 figures somehow connected to the van? Did I stumble across something I wasn't supposed to see? Or was it just one big, weird coincidence? Maybe they were just people doing some kind of midnight ritual I didn't understand. I don't know. But one thing's for sure, I haven't stepped foot in Greenwood Cemetery after dark since that night. It still feels peaceful during the day, peaceful enough for me to visit my daughter's grave when the sun's out. But once the sun goes down, no thanks. This all happened sometime between 2010 and 2012. Back then, I was around 10 or 12 years old. My dad had just gotten divorced from my mom and ended up moving into this rundown trailer park off the highway. The place was pretty much a last resort. It looked more like a dumping ground than a neighborhood. There were all kinds of folks living there. Drug houses, sketchy people, undocumented immigrants, you name it. Nobody cared where you came from. The place didn't describe me, Harper. But let me tell you, it was not the kind of place where kids should have been running around. Still, it was all my dad could afford after the divorce left him with practically nothing. He got weekend visitation, so my siblings and I would head over there every Friday and stay until Sunday. I've got 3 sisters, 2 older and 1 younger. We were spaced out by about 3 years each, so we ranged in age from around 8 to 14 back then. My dad still had to work Saturdays, so he'd leave us in the trailer and tell us not to go anywhere. But of course, we never really listened. The park had 3 main rows of trailers. Funny enough, my aunt, my mom's sister, actually lived in the same lane as us, way down at the very end. So when Dad was at work, we'd just be kids doing whatever. Running through the overgrown fields behind the trailers, trying to find other kids to hang out with. My older sisters didn't have a problem making friends their age, but my little sister and I, we mostly just had each other. Most of the time, it was just me and my little sister hanging out by ourselves. Our older sisters usually kicked us out of their group, saying it was a big kid thing, and we weren't invited. We were used to it, honestly. One day, though, we overheard them and their friends talking about heading down to the creek. Now, that place was strictly off-limits unless our dad was with us. It could be dangerous if you weren't careful. To get there, you had to pass the last trailer on our lane, which was my aunt's place, then go through this narrow clearing. Eventually, you'd reach a drop-off that led to a steep, rough hill. And I don't mean a gentle slope either. You had to be seriously careful climbing up or down, or you'd risk tumbling a good 10 or 15 feet. It was more like scrambling down a cliff than a hike. We used thick tree roots, little handholds, and a few makeshift steps to get down safely. But once you hit the bottom, there was a stretch of soft sand and these narrow streams of water running through. During the rainy season, the streams would swell and the current could pick up a bit. Sometimes our dad would bring his fishing gear and cast a line up the stream, or we'd just throw on some old clothes and splash around in the water. So, when we heard our sisters were heading down there, we immediately started begging them to let us tag along. At first, they weren't having it, but then they figured, why not? And decided we could all turn it into a little swim day. We threw on our bathing suits, grabbed some towels, and started the walk toward the creek. One of my sister's friends had these two small dogs that followed her around like shadows, so they came too. That wasn't anything new. It had rained a few days before, so we knew the hill would be muddy, maybe a bit harder to manage, but we'd done it once or twice like that before, so we figured we could handle it. But when we got to the drop-off, it was clear this was worse than usual. The whole hillside was slick with mud, and even my sisters, who were usually like little mountain goats, were struggling to keep their footing on the way down. That made me nervous. Once they finally made it, it was just me and my little sister left at the top. She didn't waste any time and started climbing down, but I hesitated. I don't know, I got this weird feeling in my gut, something just felt off. I didn't want to go back alone, but I wasn't too eager to follow either. My sisters started yelling up at me, getting annoyed. Said if I didn't come down soon, they'd leave me behind. So I sucked it up, took a deep breath, and made my way down. Surprisingly, I didn't have any issues. I actually made it down easier than I thought I would. Once I reached the bottom, everyone was grouped up, making some kind of game plan. While they chatted, I wandered a little, walking barefoot through the sand. The area around the creek was full of trees, low-hanging branches, and lots of brush. Still, that uneasy feeling stuck with me. I figured it was just the thought of having to climb that muddy hill again later. A few minutes later, we started moving. We followed the stream a little ways, just walking through ankle-deep water while the dogs sniffed every tree and marked every bush like it was their job. The water was so clear you could see all the little pebbles resting at the bottom like they were on display. As we strolled along the trail, we noticed a tree that hadn't been there before. It had recently fallen, and it was massive. Luckily, it hadn't crashed directly into the stream we were following. Instead, it had toppled in such a way that it landed across the creek, hanging above us at a slight angle. We figured the rain from the night before must have been stronger than we thought, strong enough to bring down a whole tree. One of the girls pointed out that the only thing keeping that beast of a tree from crashing down on us was this one thick root still clinging to the ground. We all gathered around it, just staring in silence for a bit. It was kind of mesmerizing, huge, out of place, and honestly a little unsettling. Then, out of nowhere, the dogs just lost it, barking like crazy. It caught us all off guard because up until that moment, everything had been still and quiet. We hadn't seen another person all afternoon. The dogs were darting around, barking up at random trees, their heads snapping in every direction like they were tracking something we couldn't see. We figured it was probably a bird or maybe a squirrel, but even that didn't quite add up. My sister's friend was trying to settle her dogs down, but they weren't listening at all. Everyone was talking at once, trying to get the dogs under control, when suddenly this loud sound ripped through the woods. It was deep and booming, almost like thunder rolling in, but not quite right. It echoed all around us, and then we started picking up the distinct sound of twigs snapping. But these weren't little dry sticks breaking under a footstep, these were thick, heavy branches giving way. That's when we all turned to look at the fallen tree again and saw the root, the one holding it up, starting to give out. Panic hit us hard. The whole thing began to shift and slide down the slope, coming straight at us. I just froze. I don't know why. I couldn't get my legs to move. My sisters were shouting my name, telling me to get out of the way, but I felt like I was cemented to the ground. Everyone's eyes were locked on the tree, and then, this part I'll never forget, a giant hand reached out from underneath it. It grabbed onto a smaller tree nearby, almost like it was trying to stop the tree from falling completely. We all saw it. Every single one of us. And we screamed. Nobody waited around after that. People bolted toward the drop-off, dogs and all. Even the dogs stopped barking and ran. I lingered for a second, staring at what I'd just seen, before finally turning and running after them. That hand, it was enormous. The fingers were long and wrapped all the way around the tree trunk like it was nothing. And the skin, if you can even call it that, was camouflaged. It blended right into the surrounding leaves and moss like it belonged there. We scrambled up the drop-off, slipping and getting covered in mud, but nobody cared. Once we reached the top and caught our breath, we all started talking over each other, trying to make sense of what just happened. Some folks said they didn't see anything, just ran because the rest of us did. Others swore they saw the hand. I didn't say much, I was too stunned to speak. Eventually, most of them brushed it off and went about their day like nothing happened. But I couldn't. I went straight home. Even now, I have no clue what we saw out there. But whatever it was, it saved us. Now that I'm older, I sometimes wonder if it could have been something not of this world, maybe an alien, or hell, even Bigfoot. I know it sounds insane, but I saw it with my own eyes. It definitely wasn't human, no way. Whatever it was had serious strength. If it was some kind of alien or otherworldly thing, well, it saved a bunch of kids from getting crushed by a massive tree trunk. I'll never forget that. And to think, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary when I booked that cruise leaving out of Miami. Honestly, I just needed a break. Between juggling a part-time job and trying to keep up with college assignments, I was running on fumes. The plan was simple: get some sun, overeat at the buffet, maybe catch a few decent shows on board, and just unwind. I had no idea that this trip would end up sticking with me in ways I never saw coming. We left port on a bright Thursday morning. Everyone on the ship was full of energy, excited, loud, already in vacation mode. I remember standing at the railing, watching the Miami skyline slowly fade into the distance, thinking to myself, finally, I get to breathe. That first day was pretty perfect, to be honest. I hung out by the pool most of the afternoon, sipping cold drinks, chatting casually with other passengers, just that easy, lazy cruise vibe. But that evening, I noticed a guy lurking around the cabin hallways. He looked older, maybe late 50s, thinning hair, pale skin that hadn't seen the sun in a while. At first, I figured he was just another bored guest stretching his legs, but something about him didn't sit right with me. He kept glancing around like he was anxious, or like he was hiding something. I tried to shake it off. Told myself I was being dramatic. Maybe too much sun. But by the second day, something in the air had shifted. I spotted that same guy again. Not just once or twice, he kept popping up. Whether I was waiting in line at the buffet or browsing the ship's souvenir shop, he always seemed to be somewhere close by. It was never a direct approach either. He'd just be there. And every time our eyes met, he'd turn away real fast. But I knew he was watching me. I started getting this tight feeling in my chest every time I noticed him. It got under my skin. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. My cabin felt suffocating, even with the AC blasting. I flipped on the TV. Some old sitcom was playing, laugh track and all, but it didn't help. If anything, the fake laughter made things feel weirder. Around 2 a.m., I swear I heard someone testing the handle on my door. I froze, completely still, heart pounding in my ears. I waited. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Maybe it was just some drunk passenger who got lost and tried the wrong door. That's what I told myself, anyway. But it still made my skin crawl. By day 3, I was desperate to shake off the anxiety. So I signed up for a shore excursion, figured getting off the ship would help clear my head. We took a smaller boat out to a private island for snorkeling. It was supposed to be one of the best parts of the trip. But even surrounded by ocean and sunshine, I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting that guy to be there. Strangely, he hadn't come along on the trip. At least, not that I saw. But that didn't stop the tension from creeping in. My thoughts kept drifting back to the ship, to that feeling I'd had the night before. When we finally returned to the cruise, I went straight to my cabin to shower and regroup. The hallways were mostly empty. Most folks were still out partying or enjoying the island. And that's when I saw him again. Out of the corner of my eye, just as I was turning the corner, I spotted him at the far end of the corridor. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. Before I could react, he slipped through a nearby stairwell door and disappeared. I was hit with this sudden jolt of panic. I wanted to run after him or do something, anything, but my body just wouldn't move. That night, I figured being around people might make me feel safer, so I went to one of the live shows in the main theater. It was packed, which helped, at first. But halfway through the performance, I spotted him again, just a few rows behind me. The moment I saw him, that now familiar wave of dread washed over me. We'd never spoken, not once, but there he was again, lingering nearby like some shadow I couldn't shake. I couldn't understand it. Why me? I knew I couldn't handle another night of tossing and turning, so around midnight I slipped out to the deck, hoping the ocean breeze might do something to ease my nerves. The deck was nearly empty, just quiet and still, and for the first time in days, I actually felt a little calm. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate ones. I turned around, and sure enough, he was there. Maybe 20 feet away, leaning on the railing, staring out at the ocean like he didn't even notice me. But I knew he had. He saw me step outside. We both knew it. I didn't stick around to find out what he was planning. My heart jumped into overdrive as I rushed back to my cabin, practically sprinting down that tight hallway. Once inside, I jammed a chair under the doorknob like some scene out of a bad thriller movie. I felt silly, sure, but I didn't care. Better paranoid than sorry. On the final morning, we docked back in Miami. I was one of the first off the ship, doing everything I could not to make eye contact with anyone. I just wanted off. But as I stood waiting for my luggage, I spotted him again. He was just standing there, alone, suitcase in hand, not pretending to look busy, not checking his phone, not doing anything. Just staring. And his expression, it was strange, like he knew something I didn't. It's been a few weeks since then. I'm back home now, trying to settle into the usual routine. But honestly, he still haunts me. Every time I space out in class or lose focus at work, I end up thinking about him. Who was he? Did he even realize how much he was creeping me out? Or was it all in my head? I still find myself checking over my shoulder sometimes, just in case. Half expecting to see him watching me from across the street or standing at the corner, waiting. I guess some things just cling to you. No explanation. No closure. They dig in deep and refuse to let go. And to be honest, that feeling, it wasn't entirely new to me. I've dealt with that kind of weight before. Not long ago, I actually made the decision to quit being a full-time cop. I had an incident that stuck with me, one I just couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. It happened back in March of 2021, right in the middle of the day. I was still on duty then. I had just pulled into the drive-thru of a local restaurant when I noticed a familiar face in a red car. His name was Travis Whitman Jr., and he had an active warrant out for his arrest. I saw him open the passenger side door. The driver took off, and I followed. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute later, I flipped on the sirens. The car pulled over, and both I and another officer stepped out of our cruiser. He headed toward the driver's side while I made my way to the passenger window. Travis was sitting there, window cracked just a bit, and a woman was behind the wheel. I kept my voice calm. "Hey, Travis. Hate to tell you this, but it looks like there's a warrant out for you in Illinois," I said. "Mind handing me some ID?" He told me he didn't have it. So I asked him to step out of the car so I could confirm who he was. He didn't move. I repeated myself, 4, maybe 5 more times. Still nothing. I stayed respectful, but my patience was wearing thin. That's when he slowly rolled the window all the way up, then shoved the woman out of the driver's seat, and climbed over into her spot. She immediately tried to get back into the car, almost like she knew something bad was about to happen. I quickly stepped around to the front of the car and shouted for Travis to stop and get out, this time with a lot more urgency in my voice. The other officer reached into the vehicle, trying to stop him too, but it didn't work. Travis had taken the wheel by then, and I climbed up onto the hood of the car, crouching low with my gun out, aimed straight at him. For the first 20 seconds or so, he was going slow, and part of me hoped he'd come to his senses and do the right thing. But as time ticked by, he started hitting the gas harder. Soon we were flying down the road at 40, maybe even 50 miles an hour. I won't lie, I started to really fear for my life. I had shifted onto the roof by then, holding on for dear life, when suddenly, my gun flew out of my hand, and one of my shoes flew right off my foot. Up ahead, I spotted a train rolling along the tracks. To avoid it, Travis jerked the car to the left, and I was still clinging to the top like some kind of action movie stunt gone wrong. We were now barreling toward a construction site, and I noticed a ditch up ahead. Just as we got close, the car hit a bump. I went flying off the roof and slammed down hard on my back. The pain was instant. I'd broken part of my lower spine. Almost right away, a police car rolled up and screeched to a stop just seconds after I hit the ground. Travis didn't stop though. He kept driving until he disappeared from sight. I lay there, unable to move, the pain blinding. It felt like my whole body was on fire. Thankfully, help wasn't far behind. Another officer had called for medical assistance, and within minutes, paramedics were loading me into an ambulance. I was taken to the hospital where they began treating my injuries. As the hours passed, one by one, folks from the station came to check on me. It meant a lot. They just wanted to make sure I was still breathing. The sheriff later filled me in on what happened after I was thrown off the car. Travis had made it about a mile further before the stolen car finally broke down. Then, in true Travis fashion, he broke into someone's garage and swiped another vehicle. Turns out, that red car he was driving? Yep, stolen too. They did catch him, though. Arrested on the spot. The woman he was with, she wasn't hurt, thank God. They got her back home safely. Fast forward a year, Travis was found guilty. The year after that, the Judge Whitaker gave him 5 years behind bars. I was able to get back to work 3 months after the accident, but honestly, I never fully recovered emotionally. By the end of 2024, I decided to quit the force for good. That whole ordeal shook me to the core. Like I said at the very start of this story, there's no way I'll ever forget what it felt like to hang on to a speeding car, knowing I was one wrong move away from dying. It took me a full year to heal from the spinal injury. And even now, I take extra care with anything physical. I can't afford to mess my back up again. Funny enough, Travis did eventually apologize, and I forgave him. I truly hope that when he gets out, he straightens his life out. I really do. Back in 2017, before all this madness, I'd taken my SUV deep into the wilderness, way off the grid, far from paved roads or towns. It was a solo camping trip I'd been planning for a while. Just me, the woods, and the stars overhead. I'd filled up the tank, packed up enough water and gear to last me days, and as I drove away from the city, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: total freedom. After hours of bouncing along rocky trails, I came across this small clearing beside a quiet little stream. The water barely moved, just a soft trickle really, but it was peaceful. Giant pine trees surrounded the area, their shadows stretching long as the sun began to set. There wasn't a soul around. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and birds calling out in the distance. Everything had fallen into place just right. I set up my camp, got a little fire going, and threw together a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled in, I sat there sipping hot tea, watching stars slowly appear in the night sky like scattered diamonds. Wrapped up in a warm jacket, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. I was alone, sure, but it was the good kind of alone. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet sink in. Once the air started to bite a little harder, I climbed into my SUV for shelter. I had turned the back of it into a makeshift sleeping area, pulling out the seats so I could stretch out properly. After slipping into my sleeping bag, I shut off the lantern and let my eyes close. The silence out there was soothing, and before long, I was out cold. But at some point in the night, I jolted awake. Something had reached my ears, a low, steady sound off in the distance. It wasn't the wind. Definitely wasn't an animal either. It sounded like chanting. I froze, straining to hear better. The voices were faint, riding the breeze like whispers. My mind went into overdrive. I hadn't seen another soul for miles. Who in the world would be out here in the middle of nowhere, chanting in the dead of night? I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag, my ears locked on the sound. The chanting kept going, soft but clear enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. My heart was pounding while I sat there, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't have a phone signal. No battery left. No way to call for help. I tried to convince myself it was just some campers nearby. Maybe a weird ritual, or just messing around. It didn't make much sense, but it was better than thinking the worst. Clutching the knife, I forced myself to lie back down. Somehow, I drifted off again, though the chanting still echoed faintly in my thoughts. Then came the knock. It started quiet, just a soft tap on the SUV window. My breath caught instantly. The tapping got louder, more intentional. My pulse shot up as I froze, barely daring to breathe. Through the fogged-up glass, I could just make out a shadow. A face. Someone was right there, staring in. Something primal took over. I let out this loud, raw scream, straight from the gut. The figure jerked back fast. For just a second, I saw their eyes, wide, startled, before they turned and disappeared into the night. No footsteps. No crunching branches. Just dead silence. I stayed there, frozen, still gripping the knife. My chest was heaving, mind spinning, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Who the hell was that? What were they doing out here? The questions came one after another, no answers in sight. I reached for the ignition and fired up the SUV, lighting up the clearing. The headlights cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. No sign of the person who'd been right at my window. I kept the engine running for over an hour, eyes scanning the woods, jumping at every little sound. When exhaustion finally wore me down, I shut the engine off to save fuel and held the knife so tightly my hands hurt. When morning finally came, it brought a sliver of relief. I stepped outside careful, eyes darting around. That's when I noticed the footprints, light impressions in the dirt, barefoot, and small. My stomach turned. I packed everything up in record time. That peaceful feeling from the night before was gone. The forest didn't feel like a getaway anymore. It felt wrong. I needed to put distance between myself and whatever that was. I drove for hours, winding through endless dirt roads. Every noise had me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had followed me out of that night. Every single shadow made me jump. I was on edge, flinching at the slightest movement. Eventually, I stumbled across another clearing, not too far off, nestled near a rocky hill. The sun was beating down by then, casting this warm, golden light over everything. It felt safer than the last spot. Not completely safe, but better. Still, I couldn't shake that creeping unease from the night before. So, I kept myself occupied. Spent the afternoon checking my gear, stacking firewood, doing whatever I could to keep my hands and my mind busy. But as the sun dipped lower, that tight feeling in my chest came back. This time, I built the fire bigger, brighter, hoping it'd keep whatever, or whoever, was out there at bay. I even placed a ring of sticks around my camp, thinking maybe they'd snap if someone stepped too close. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to focus on. That night, I sat close to the fire, a small cup of tea warming my hands. The flames danced and flickered, casting long shadows that moved like they were alive, creeping along the edges of the clearing. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, just my imagination messing with me. But I couldn't get that face out of my head, the one I'd seen pressed against the glass. The night carried a strange weight, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. When I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, I crawled back into the SUV and locked the doors tight, gripping the knife like it was the only thing keeping me safe. I barely drifted off before I heard it, branches snapping nearby. Loud. Close. My eyes shot open. I didn't even think, just reached for the keys. The sounds kept coming, growing heavier, nearer. I started the engine and flicked on the headlights. At first, nothing. Just empty trees. Then, in the distance, something moved fast. A shape darted between the trunks, just beyond where the light reached. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Whoever it was, they were too quick to make out, just a blur disappearing into the woods like they were never there at all. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife in hand, eyes scanning every shadow, flinching at every little sound. When the first light finally broke through the treetops, I didn't waste a second. I threw everything in the back, fired up the engine, and drove. I was done. Heading back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. I kept checking my mirrors, over and over, half expecting to see a face staring back at me or someone tailing the car. When I finally hit the main road, a wave of relief hit me like a punch to the gut. The tension in my chest loosened just a little. But the questions kept coming. Who was out there? Why did they come to my camp? And worst of all, what would have happened if I hadn't woken up?